2, 1. But hello, everyone, and we are finally live. It's Bella, and I am on with the amazing and lovely, I think I'm pointing in the right direction, Fleurista, and I'm linking to her channel right now in chat. It'll also be linked in the description of this video, and she is just absolutely amazing. So, Fleurista, why don't you tell my viewers a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words and introduction. Yes, I've been on YouTube and I've kind of made this Fleurista channel as kind of my talk about gender, talk about trans, talk about feminism, talk about the whole debate, gender critical and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of my nom de plume for that online kind of stuff. And I've been kind of doing it for since about January, kind of exploring that stuff. And I'm very new to all of that, gender critical feminism, kind of the whole gender ideology debate. I've been transitioned for about 10 years, and I really didn't spend a whole lot of time in the trans community. So I had a bad experience with it early on, and so I kind of went away pretty early. But thanks to the pandemic, ended up back online and learning about all kinds of fun stuff that I wish I didn't know, but now I do.
Yeah,
So.
it's like once you know, you can't go back. And I feel that pain almost with a lot of the trans community, almost like I don't want to burst the bubble. I don't want to start them thinking about stuff that once it all
Yeah.
gets in their head, it'll be a brainworm and they can't get it out, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's stressful. I mean, how do you know, How do you know? I'm also going to very quickly load up my chat on my phone so that I can see the comments as they come in. So
Oh,
we
that's
have,
smart. I was like trying to figure out how to look at what.
I think if you you can probably load the chat up live on the side and you can see them. Welcome, AA. Happy to have you. So yeah, we have 3 things that we're going to talk about, but the general theme of the whole thing is sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, is gender critical trans liberation, because both of us, I would say, consider ourselves now gender critical. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say for myself, like I lean gender critical. Be the way
Yes, I had a
I
curious
put it.
question.
I don't know if I feel like if you're trans, it's kind of hard to be fully gender critical so long as you're transitioned.
What do you mean by that? Like, I'm curious.
Well, gender critical kind of seeks to abolish gender as a whole, or being kind of confined to sex role stereotypes, which kind of fundamentally gender critical people believe that transitioning reinforces those. So, by living as we live, as gender critical as we may be, we're still kind of reinforcing that.
I mean, so I get what you mean, but don't like non-trans people also reinforce that?
They do. I think for us though, it's conscience. Like it's conscious as far as like, I'm saying, oh, I'm a gender critical person, I'm trans and I'm gender critical. Where it's, I don't know, I feel like slightly hypocritical, which is kind of what some of my last videos have been about, where it's like I feel a little hypocritical.
Oh,
But I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, yeah. I guess if you don't claim to be a different gender, then you're not like being a hypocrite in any of the things that you say, right? I don't know. I don't know if it's much more hypocritical than just a straight guy wearing a suit and tie or something. A cis guy wearing a suit and tie or something.
Yeah. I don't think it's hypocritical. Although I guess you could make the argument, like, if say you have like a guy who is saying he's gender critical, but he wants to, still wear a suit to work and all that kind of thing, or do whatever kind of, classic stereotypical manly man thing, then like I would feel like he's being maybe a little hypocritical if he's going to call himself like I am gender critical or whatever, like fully gender critical. It's like it's hard to say that you're fully gender critical if you're like reinforcing that. So maybe hypocritical is like a bit of a strong word, but I apply that to myself. But I'm uh, I'm rather critical of myself, so maybe that's a bit of a hyperbole.
I
Maybe it's
mean,
not hypocritical.
because in a gender abolished society, some people might want to wear suits just because of it, and that person may happen to be one of them. So I don't know why we would judge a guy for wearing suits and thereby upholding gender roles in society today if we wouldn't judge like a natal female for wearing suits or a woman for wearing suits in that way.
I mean, looking on over it, I feel like I do see some of that judgment. I mean, just in general. So it's not like just applied towards trans people, but people who aren't trans even. Just through the lens of looking at kind of all of society as reinforcing stereotypical gender roles or sex roles. But I feel like if you're trans, it's difficult to like subscribe to being trans, and I guess that's just it, because it's a testament to maybe how little control I have over the way I perceive my gender, if we want to call it that, if that makes sense. I don't know. I kind of went on a tangent there. Sorry.
No, the tangent is very relevant, but I don't know, the matter of how one perceives one's own gender. In the same way as I think like identity politics and identity doesn't matter necessarily all that much.
I would agree. I mean, it really doesn't. It's just difficult when you're trying to abolish those things and you see like, oh, sex stereotypes are wrong and gender role stereotypes are wrong, and putting, splitting up people, men and women, into one box or another, or subscribing things to being boy things and girl things isn't right. And
Oops.
I should say, I'm sorry.
No, you just cut out for a second, that's all.
Oh, sorry. um and I'm also like, I'm watching the live stream on YouTube, and so I think it's like delayed or like ahead a little bit, and so I'm like looking at the video and I'm like realizing like, oh, that's actually like 10 seconds in the future, in the past or
Yeah, it's
something.
10 seconds in the future.
Anyways, so it with us, it's tricky because like maybe it's different for non-binary trans people or trans people who are trying to actually break out of the man woman sex roles or whatever, or gender type roles that are attributed to those sexes. But like if you're trying to present as a man, or if you're trying to present as a woman, then you are like, if you want to genuinely be perceived that way and you want to pass, like, you are going to like, to some extent, I feel like, kind of reinforce those stereotypes or whatever. Maybe not. It could vary with different people, I think, because it's one thing to say, I like to watch musicals because that's a feminine thing, and I'm feminine, so I'm going to watch musicals. It's one thing to say that versus, I just happen to like musicals, and I happen to be seen as feminine or perceived as a female, and it just so happens I like that. It just so happens that it's stereotyped with that. So you have like those. I guess there's room for that kind of nuance, I feel like.
Yeah, I think so.
If
I
that makes
mean,
sense.
I think because and there's also a very key difference in saying that those behaviors that other people commonly code as masculine or feminine aren't what define you as either as a masculine or feminine person or as a man or a woman. I think that is a large part of the gender critical gripe, almost, if that makes sense. The idea that clothing and fashion and aesthetics all is what makes somebody a woman, because then that becomes an expectation that gets put on women that they have to live up to, and that becomes a gender role in itself. My worry with, I guess, taking the approach that somebody, because being opposed to traditional gender roles doesn't mean you have to do the opposite of that, because then you're still being defined by gender roles. You're just doing the opposite,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, awesome. So our topics as well. I might copy paste them into the into YouTube chat.
Ooh, I like it.
Yes, I prepared, guys. I wrote down notes like a boss. Oh, it's a bit too long. Let's see if I can do it piecemeal.
There you go. I
Damn.
love the highlighting. You did bring the highlighting you promised you would, and you delivered.
Yes,
Thank you.
we've got like relaxing. It's like visual ASMR.
I love it. That's it. Yeah, spot on.
Yes. So we've got 3
Yeah,
points.
I keep forgetting too what you wrote.
No, that's fine. I forget as well. Right. So our three points. First of all, because essentially what this stream is about is trying to identify where gender critical feminist and gender critical rhetoric could align with trans people to politically advocate in ways that are beneficial for both of us. And it's because it's something that ContraPoints, for instance, has said in her video on gender critical, that most trans people agree on gender abolition, as most gender critical feminists also advocate for. So she says, why are we arguing so much when we agree on the general, or at least on the end goal, right? And then I realized that, especially when I was considering detransition, I realized that a lot of the things that radical feminists are advocating for would also make my life easier. And one of those big ones, for
I
instance,
feel that.
is
Yeah.
asserting the rights for people with varied body types to be in single sex spaces without reproach or harassment. And this would make life easier also for non-passing trans people who, I mean, I think maybe some do use the spaces of the opposite sex, but I think for the most part they don't, especially not trans women, because of the whole predatory rhetoric around that, whereas the same isn't quite true for trans men for understandable reasons. People aren't terrified of there being a woman in the men's restroom, say.
Yeah.
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 And then so asserting the right for people to be in with varied body types to be in single sex spaces, like, it's one of the things that is annoying for me about using male restrooms and such, as I get stares, like sometimes get told to leave, etc. And that's awkward. But a gender critical politics and a gender critical feminist would assert that no, I have a right to be in there without being harassed or looked down upon because of the way I dress or the way I present myself. And this is something which I think if the trans community were to change to advocating for, it would make life for trans people much easier, because at the end of the day, I think, frankly, trans people only want to use the spaces of the opposite sex because we associate that space with validation into our gender role, rather than recognizing that those spaces are meant to be segregated for sex. Same with trans women in sport as well. I mean, what was her name again? Laurel Hubbard. She,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, the weightlifter.
yeah. I mean, she. The whole point of having men and women's sports categories is because those are biological categories, because in the context of sports it actually matters a lot more. you know. And I think that the argument for her inclusion was that she's a woman, and we're trying to recognize woman as a social category, as Kathleen Stock sort of directly argues against in her book Material Girls. And I think ultimately, if we were to, as trans people, recognize that we could achieve the same thing, like the trans people who have to use the or who still do use the restrooms for people still use the spaces associated with their birth sex, I think would feel less dysphoric about it if we discoupled the idea that these spaces and these social roles are gender roles, if that makes sense. Like, if we didn't think of it as like masculine people go into the men's room and feminine people go into the women's room. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Completely removing that attribution to sex and only keeping it focused on sex. That's what I find to be interesting in, like, how the gender ideologues, or what Gendercritical calls gender ideologues or trans rights activists, their core belief, or I would say their biggest goal, like, aligns totally right on with Gendercritical's big goal of abolishing that. But it's just kind of strange when you look at it from then the gender ideologues and the trans rights activists. They advocate for that, but then they are you have some people who, I guess it goes to maybe the medical model, where you have the people who are trying to abolish and de-medicalize transsexualism. They don't even want to call it that. Gender dysphoria, any kind of cross-sex, cross-gender identity, depathologize it, which I think is a good thing on a level. But then you have the others where it's like, hey, we look at it medically. You call them like the trans medicalists or the true scum or whatever, and that this is really really a thing. And we follow the old school model, and of course the old school diagnostic model relies on hardcore on stereotypes. And I can see where, like, they kind of try to get away with that with the update of gender dysphoria, maybe a little bit, but not totally.
So I'm not familiar with the update. So what's the update to the diagnostic criteria?
Well, going from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, so uh, they're very similar. The key thing is that there is gender identity disorder. Back when that was the thing, there was no concept of non-binary. There was, like, no concept of other genders or other sexes. Like, it was just man and woman, male, female. So everything that they write about is more about, like, interests in stereotypical activities of the opposite sex. So it's more focused on problems with uh, identifying or feeling comfortable with your own sex and gender roles, and then having identification with the opposite sex or gender roles. Whereas gender dysphoria, they kind of broaden that to just having any kind of general discomfort with your sex or just your gender role, or wanting to, like, identifying or wanting to be a gender or sex that they say that is not one's own. So they instead of being the opposite, they kind of, that's where they opened it up to, well, how many genders are there and what kinds of different ones are there? So
Right.
that the classic is more, I think, a little I guess you'd say sexist. The newer updated version is a little less so. However, I feel like the newer one has made it so it includes people who aren't, like, wouldn't be considered for transition, like, in the past. They would not have ever been considered for this kind of treatment and stuff.
Yes.
And people who still don't see themselves as transsexual, the treatment is all based on, like, transsexualism and, like, how they established that, like, back in, I don't know, the 50s, 60s, or whatever. for decades or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's a real as much as I don't love her writing in her book Gender Hurts, Sheila Jeffreys points out that the construction of transsexualism as a mental illness, much the same way as the construction of homosexuality as a mental illness historically served certain social functions, the main one that Raymond focuses on is the protection against conformity, the protection against the compulsion to conform to cis heteronormative values. Because if somebody says, I'm gay and this is a mental condition that I have and it's immutable because medical professionals have claimed that it is so, people couldn't pressure or couldn't morally pressure them into trying to change their ways, hence the born this way narrative. And the same became true of transsexual people as well. And I think there's that, but part of it is that transmedicalism and the medical gatekeeping did serve to put defined boundaries on who was and wasn't trans, and therefore who had uncontested access, or not uncontested, but who had a better claim to access spaces of the opposite sex. I mean, this is what J.K. Rowling talks about in her essay, where she mentions her trans female friend who went through a long sort of checked process. And I think that checked process, knowing that there are boundaries in place, meaning that not anyone can claim that they are transgender and go into certain places, is an advantage of transmedicalism. It's often perceived as a disadvantage, but the exclusionary nature of it, I think, rhetorically works better, because we are essentially arguing that the categories of gender, or I should say, I shouldn't say we anymore, but like trans people and trans activists are arguing generally that the categories of man and woman should at some point in society be abolished. But for the time being, trans people should be able to assimilate into the one that is more comfortable for them. That's what ContraPoints argues in her video, Gendercritical. But it's almost ignorant of the fact that categories in society function because they have boundaries and they include and exclude certain kinds of people. And gender identity as a model for gender is not exclusive, it's very expansive. And I think that therefore lets too many people in, and because it lets too many people in, it can make radical feminists rather worried about the consequences of that. And J.K. Rowling is maybe a prime example of that worry coming through. You get what I mean?
Well, I think that worry's legitimate. I mean, you see it. I think the horrifying thing is it's hard enough seeing adults who are kind of getting kind of roped up into this. And I feel like it's a lot of adults who are having some kind of identity issue, not necessarily relating to sex and gender. Because I feel like, I think we kind of mentioned it, but like beyond this point, I don't know if it's in the last 5 years or 5, 10, whatever years, that like trans is synonymous with identity changing. Not about sex, it's not about gender, it's about changing identity, or it's about you want other people to see you a different way than they already see you. Like you want them to see you the way you see yourself, or however. So I feel bad at seeing like adults get pulled into this, because it seems like a lot are. But I really feel bad, and really angry at watching kids get pulled into this, because that is like the double-edged sword of now having, you know, having this breakdown. So you have this kind of gender critical esque, argument of, we want to break down gender roles. Gender roles do not define you. Your sex does not limit what you can do. So you have that like positive kind of aspect of it, but that's mashed together with the other sides, the gender ideologue, trans rights activists saying like, yeah, that's right. Those don't limit you, and you know why? Because they're like, what? those are limiting in themselves. Like, there's not just man and woman. Like, there could be any kind of gender, there could be any kind of sex. And then you have gender critical, like, well, that's not right. Like, well, why not? And so there's the argument there. So the, like, you know, arguing for it. But that's where I feel awful for these kids getting pulled into it, because you've got the mashup of the two different things, and these poor kids, I feel like, I mean, you learn as I feel like a lot of trans people, if you grew up experiencing, you know, a cross-sex identity and dysphoria, that you know, you figure out that nobody else thinks about this stuff. Like, you know, you think that other people think about this, you think that other kids think about this, but then you learn at some point that they don't, that you're the weird one.
Yes.
And suddenly now we're making all these kids think about this. Like, it was awful thinking about that stuff as a kid. Why would you want anyone else to think about it? And so that, combined then with, you know, the informed consent, particularly the informed consent for minors, which is like, I don't come on.
Yes.
I feel really something about that. But yeah, combining it all together with that, I mean, you're just stirring up this confusion in these kids, and you're starting off from a good premise, but kids don't have that life experience, and they don't have that context. They don't have that, like, stability. They're still, like, developing their personalities and their, you know, who they are and all that. So it's, I don't know, it just seems really unfair, and these poor kids just don't stand a chance.
Absolutely. If you could just restart your webcam for a second, because you've your camera has gone
snap.
off. But no, I completely agree. Oh, we have a question. How does the trans? Ooh, this is a very interesting question. Let's answer this. From AA, how does the trans community treat the gender critical leaning people? What is it like for you people? Ooh, Fleurista, do you want to answer first?
Oh gosh. Okay. That's my camera. The camera's struggling.
Yes, there we go.
I'll
You're
keep playing
back.
with it.
Lovely.
Hey, yeah. Let me flip the question. Okay, so, well, I've been, a little bit of context. I gotta say that gender critical people, just like trans people, are all different. There's all kinds of different kinds, and the only thing they have in common is having gender critical beliefs. So you have some that are radical feminists, some that are very much not, and are kind of more like men's rights activists or whatever, you know, but they can still be considered gender critical together. So I guess I wanted to add that little, I don't know if caveat's the right word, but so I have interacted with a lot of different kinds of gender critical people, and most of them, I think they appreciate when you are trans and you are receptive to criticizing things, and you're receptive to criticism, and you're receptive to the idea of that you might be wrong. I think that opens a lot of doors, because I feel like if you are a respectful person, you get treated generally pretty respectfully by gender critical people. I think what is difficult is, as a trans person, you kind of need to run through a sort of little gauntlet of
Yes.
of seeing just how thick-skinned or thin-skinned you really are, because if you can't tolerate being called your natal sex, like, it's just probably never going to happen that you can really get on with anyone with gender critical views.
Yeah,
with
like that is
trans.
something I bristle with a bit, because they sort of, even if you believe that we shouldn't feel that way about being called our natal sex, not recognizing that that's going to pose a real substantial barrier for somebody to engage in a discussion, even in and it might be more practical to compromise on that aspect of rhetoric just to get them into the room and then talk to them about it, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I've definitely experienced that in gender critical communities. The two ones I've hung out in most are two Discord servers. I used to participate a bit in gender critical debates queer theory when it was still up on Reddit, but I don't anymore. The other one
You should come
that
back.
I'm on the Discord server for
Oh,
it.
are you? I just joined.
Oh yes, it's fun, yeah. But I haven't participated there too, too much, but much more so I participated in King Critical's Discord server. King Critical is a big gender critical YouTuber, and funnily enough, I was initially trying to set up a debate with him, although now it would be, I think, less of a going at him debate and more of a discussion since I have come around. But definitely within that community, a good number of people were like, I respect that you're able to admit certain things and you are open to listening. They rather appreciate that because I think a lot of gender critical people get this block don't interact mentality from those people. I had a friend, a close friend, who said that he was considering when I sort of first said that I've been convinced by gender critical argument. He said he was considering cutting me off and not talking to me anymore because he regarded it as so horrible that I would be gender critical, you know? So I think when
Gosh.
you I know, right? So when you say that you're open to ideas, I think they're very welcome to that. And I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
I don't hang out that much in the trans community, and maybe I should to get a better perspective on the whole matter. So I don't know if the trans community is closed-minded more so.
I feel like so I started this year. I started this year. I was online trying to find other people to relate to on a totally unrelated matter. Just kind of a just support sort of thing.
Mm.
And I ended up finding about like true scum and trans medicalists and stuff. So that was really the first trans area I kind of hung out in. And I really agreed with a lot of it at first. And I agree with, uh, I like the more critical approach. But I kind of got really put off by kind of what I saw as like a hypocrisy, that intolerance of that certain trans community. So I guess for context, for anyone who doesn't know what true scum or trans medicalist is, it's like people. I can't remember if you already said it or not.
I don't think I have, so you should define it, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, just so people who believe that you need to have gender dysphoria to be trans. That is like the baseline belief, I guess, across.
And usually that it
It
has to be sort
varies.
of overseen and diagnosed by medical professionals.
Right, right. It's very, I mean, yeah, it's very much about the this is a medical condition. Requires medical treatment. You know, transgender is a medical term and that kind of thing. Um, and so that was the kind of group I was hanging with. They're very unpopular with kind of the larger trans population because they're viewed as pro gatekeeper, and ironically, they're viewed as kind of the gender critical rad femmes of the
Yes.
trans population. They're just like one step above them.
So you know how gender critical feminists call people who don't also oppose trans people what's the word? Oh, what do they call them again? Handmaidens. You know how they call them
Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah.
They call like us bootlickers.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Get called that a lot. Turf bootlicker.
And that's a way that
It's the
I've
popular
noticed that a
phrase.
lot of people sort of, I guess, not rationalize, because it's not too much of a rational thing, but like explain away trans people who don't agree with the narrative is they say that we're like really self-hating, which in my case is
Yeah.
true, but like rude.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of the pot calling the kettle black there. I mean, not to say everyone's self-hating it's trans, but that's yeah, I hate that. I hate like getting called that. And that's actually what like really annoyed me because I was posting in there, and what really got to me is I have a problem with, I had said before that I participated in the like trans support groups when I very first came out, and I was like 23, 24. And so this was like 2013 ish. And they, the, it was all older trans women in these groups. And I'd like told you before in private, like they're kind of just, for lack of a better word, lecherous, and just a lot of sexual harassment, and really uncomfortable and really shitty and really creepy and just not good. And I've had a problem with the that being allowed, and the fact that you can't talk about it. And so I tried to bring that up in the trans community, because for me that's a big thing to me. That is especially for other things I've experienced that I won't get into, that matters to me, to be able to share that, to be able to have that acknowledged, and to be able to talk about that, and especially to be able to talk about that with other trans people who have experienced that. And I shared that on like the True Scum subreddit, and there are other people who've had similar experiences, and they have the same kind of beef with it. So I shared something about that. That ended up getting shared on Over It, which is, for people who don't know, the radical feminist, gender critical oriented website alternative basically to Reddit, when gender critical and all of these feminist and gender critical subs were deleted from Reddit or whatever, banned from Reddit.
I love how extra it is, like over it.
Yeah,
Both is in like ovary, and I'm so over it. Like I'm over this trans shit.
I've made terrible puns online with it, and I've had to like apologize because they're just so bad. But someone shared that over there, like, oh, see, it even happens to them too. And so I ended up over there because I found out that happened. And I was very I don't even know if I'd heard of gender critical before. I had heard of TERFs before, but I really didn't know anything other than TERF bad. That's kind of,
I had a really
I've never like met any or
it's like
anything.
not so that you hadn't heard of TERFs, but had you heard like queer theory arguments before in the trans community?
Yeah, I actually took an LGBT studies group in college. Gosh, I must have been 25. And it 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 was very interesting. I guess I understood kind of this. I think I gleaned a lot of this very college liberal, anything can be anything thing. And I've talked about this on the Sedits website's version of GC Debates QT, of like that the sorry, I keep losing my spot while I'm talking. Like
You're okay.
I'm
That's
like
like
90 or something.
But it reminded me though that the whole thing of this liberal idea that anything can be anything. I felt weird with liberal acceptance for that reason, because it felt like they were just going to go along with whatever I claim about myself, especially because they don't know much about the matter. And then it felt like they're only calling me a woman or whatever because it avoids conflict and it's easy, rather than it being like a real thing, which I think trans people want to transition into a real social role rather than, ironically, rather than transitioning into a deconstructed social role. So maybe that is the hypocrisy at play.
Yeah, I see that. I think what was like hardest for me to relate to, and it still is, and I don't know if I would call it, like, maybe it helped, maybe it was a good thing or not. Of so my own experience is very, just a little different than how a lot of trans people kind of end up transitioning and all that. And I could not really I could appreciate the concept that anything can be anything. And I've said that before on GC Debates QT, that like that is my hands down favorite thing about queer theory and gender ideology is I like the idea that anything can be anything. I like that general
Same.
concept. That's a
But
cool
I think what
concept.
happens in that is that when we get that idea, we sort of get this idea that we confuse the idea that your sex and your biology shouldn't influence your social roles, and that turns into denying that it ever has, like denying that trans, or finding it difficult to talk about trans women benefiting from male privilege, or talking about like men and women as biological sort of classes in society because of patriarchy. I think that is what causes the difficulty. It's almost like some queer theory focused people reject that almost on principle rather than based on an evidential basis, if that makes sense.
Rejecting which part on principle?
Rejecting the idea of like men and women as biological classes or biological like defined groups based on this idea that biology shouldn't determine your social outcomes. It goes from a prescriptive statement, which is the prescriptive statement the gender critical feminists would agree with, to a descriptive statement, which causes a lot of the problems. I mean, like, well, yeah, sports maybe is a good example. Saying that, or maybe sports is a bad one because sports is about the social, it's about the biological category rather than the social category. Maybe prisons or something like saying that these things shouldn't influence how likely one is to commit certain kinds of crime or whatever ignores the fact that people who have been socialized as men do have a higher likelihood of committing certain kinds of crime than people who are socialized female and such lots. It could even be something biological as well, or partially influenced by biology. I don't know, but
Like a mix.
yeah, denying though that there is some strong correlation with biology there, I think is not helpful.
Right. It's like, well, it's kind of swinging from one extreme to the other of saying, the number one determining factor, the most important factor is biological sex, which it is important, but, that should not be ruling our entire lives. Like, the fact that I'm male should not mean that, like, I'm only allowed to like the color blue, like that. So that kind of thing, uh, yeah, getting away from that, that's great. But swinging to the opposite, which is now we're determining that identity is more important than biology, which like conceptually that sounds very nice. Like that sounds very idealistically lovely. I like the idea that and everyone would like that, where it's like, hey, our bodies don't limit us. Our bodies don't determine, the content of our character and who we are at our core, and it shouldn't determine how we're treated by everyone else. But it's a reality. And there are instances where that has to take precedence, like you say, like in sports, and even and in places like prisons, and really anywhere where sex really does matter like that. The thing is that sex doesn't matter as much as historically we seem to think it does.
No.
However, it doesn't matter as little as now we've decided that it does.
Yeah, there's a happy balance. But so this is one of the things I want to talk about, like gender critical trans liberation, is that I think like trans people already like know and talk about sex segregated spaces where it matters. Like, have you ever seen those memes of like those trans memes about bathrooms? And I use bathrooms because they're a really like commonly talked about and illustrative example where they say instead of men's and women's bathrooms, we should have like urinals and stalls. And well, if the urinal one also has like regular stalls and it's like this is a bathroom like with urinals and this is one without, they factor your. I mean, it's not like perfectly sex based because there are going to be some intersex people who can't use either, but like that's basically a crude shorthand for having two bathrooms for biological sex because there are different sex needs. And
Right.
it's literally the idea of a same sex or a single sex space without, first of all, without the coercion element, right? Because presumably, in that situation where it's just like urinals and stalls and just stalls, like trans men are not going to go into the one with the urinals just because, presumably. And
Never know.
well, you never know. Yeah, they might just go in there and just like piss on the floor as like a protest. Like, give me my dick, god damn it. I want fallow. And I will keep peeing on the floor until I get it. But like, but so therefore, and it's like that Rick and Morty meme. It sounds like a sex segregated space with extra steps, and it kind of, and not just that, but in our biology, right? Like our medical professionals, and maybe this is again for transsexuals rather than transgender people who don't necessarily have as much interaction with the medical side of things. But medical professionals for transsexuals do use terms referring to our biological sex because obviously for trans medicine that really matters, And so I feel like honestly part of it is just that one thing I still sort of disagree with radfems on is, well, I don't know if my thoughts are up in the air about it, is whether like man and woman can be reclaimed as purely biological terms, because at the end of the day that's what's happening, right? The Radical Feminist Project is about trying to reclaim men and women as non-gendered purely biological terms, but right now that's not how we use them in society, and that's what makes it, I think, really hard for trans people to process the rhetoric. Like, honestly, I had this whole eureka moment when talking to radfems because one of them said something which sort of logically showed that she didn't think that being a man meant I had to be masculine or something like this. And then suddenly I was like, oh, they actually do believe in gender abolition. And it hit me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's well, I think that's what's difficult to even reach that point, because both sides, and I feel particularly bad for radical feminists, in that they seem to be the catch-all for the gender critical people, and they seem to be the ones just basically catching all of the flack for everything wrong with the world, regarding anything bad happening to trans people. And everyone buys into that. Like, I was just watching a Smosh video the other day, and they're like, well, what if it was a turf? And then like everyone's like, oh, it's like the most cringy thing ever. Like, goddamn. But I think that is the hardest thing, is like people going in with a mindset that you already have of like what these people believe. But like I think the overall thing of gender critical people and radical feminists are anti-trans, which is not the case. People will say that till the cows come home. And they'll point out the worst bad faith players on that in that camp and say, see, they're anti-trans or whatever. But that's not generally the case. They really want kind of the same things we want, and it's actually healthy stuff, that not limiting people by their biological sex, and abolishing those gender roles because they are so limiting. It's helpful to talk to, I think, older women, who have like lived through more and have lived through kind of the progression of women's rights, and which are sex-based rights. And it's kind of interesting to see, I think, too, as a trans woman, who you spend more time in more women's spaces, and you hear this kind of stuff, and especially if you hang out on Overt or whatever, to different feminists, I don't know, I feel like you see then like how regressive it is to, and say that it's just fine that we're gonna call blue a boy's color. That's incredibly regressive and not a healthy thing, and just how important it is to abolish that sex attribution to non-sex traits, and expression and mannerisms and all that kind of thing. Like, it's not just like, oh, this is a small thing. These are people who are very, very passionate about it because they've been living through it for decades and decades, and centuries. I mean,
Yeah.
overall, let's be honest. So it do they look like they're unhinged then because no one else is as affected? They do, and it's
Mm.
harder then to approach them. And I think they're so used to most of them are so used to immediately getting shut down by um, people, trans and non-trans allies alike. That like they're kind of already on their defense, and you go in as a trans person or ally or whatever, and you're kind of already like the oh they hate trans people kind of thing. But yeah, if you could just like break that little prejudice and just kind of suspend any sort of judgment, then you can like come to that realization like you did, where oh they want that abolition too. Like that's
Yeah.
okay. That's awesome.
And
Awesome.
that's one of the reasons I try as much as possible to use terms like natal male and natal female that the clinic uses, because I think speaking trans people's language like gets us on their side. AA has another amazing question. AA, you're on fire. You're asking great questions today.
Yeah, AA.
Yes. Have you ever noticed any class conflict within the trans community, like among people who can and can't afford surgery?
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
know of, because I've literally had a class on one of them. I've taken a module, which is a meme on
Oh.
my channel.
Oh, that's
Not
great.
specifically on class issues, but have you heard perchance of Nina Arsenault?
That name is vaguely familiar.
She's really, oh, she's controversial. We did this, so we did a week of a queer literature module on her work, and funnily enough, the guy who was teaching us was like her like lifelong friend from since college, and they met in college. It's like it was really wild. He was talking about, yeah, that's Nina, that's my mate Nina, and we were
Oh,
reading her book, and we were like talking about her work. So Nina was rejected from the Canadian gender identity clinic because they basically said she was too masculine to ever pass and transition and live as a woman. And yeah, it was
really?
interesting. Well, because she became like obsessed because of that. And I'll blow up her picture in the center. And therefore, she almost went on this quest to make her body not only almost like beyond cis, like the most plastic surgery modified you could possibly imagine. And she's had tons of work, and she's done a lot of artwork about her surgeries, and it's pretty extreme, and some of the work is quite gory. And she did that by sex work for a very long time. And part of her work is she's also written and talked about doing sex work because she couldn't afford it any other way. And that is a thing that often happens, unfortunately, in the trans community. Is people like trans women get pressured into doing sex work to pay for surgeries, at least from what I hear. And I, I do think it's a real problem with ContraPoints as a content creator, that she's only aware of her class consciousness because she knows that about checking your privilege as a thing, and that so therefore she can say, "Oh, I have so much privilege," but she doesn't actually have a sense of it. There was an interview she was doing with, I think, Vice, where she said after she left her PhD program, she was a bit destitute for a bit, and I was doing all sorts of odd jobs like writing copy and teaching piano just to get by. And then I remember that and comparing that to Kat Black, who was like, I was starving and I had no money, I had to do sex work kind of deal, and I found that really humiliating. The class the class divide is, I think, real and significant.
I think it's like intrinsically kind of related. It it isn't totally related, but it's intrinsic with there's the huge divide between trans people who pass and trans people who don't pass because they're
Mm,
worlds apart.
yeah.
Um, the the I feel like it definitely you get to be the less you can like afford surgeries. So if you're someone who can't afford surgeries, but by luck of the god, you got the traits, that afford you passability, and you really, don't have to worry about that. That's more kind of an anomaly. versus, you know, most people who can't afford surgery, who want it or whatever, you know, there's something related, I think, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, to passability. But also, you know, just just for your own well-being, your own kind of peace, you know, that you appear a certain way or function a certain way or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I mean, I'm saving up for facial feminization surgery for my brow, and people tell me I don't need it. And first of all, I'm like, no, because I can control the angle on my stream. I can't control the angle in lighting in real life. Second of all, just my personal like well-being. Even if I knew that I was passing completely without it, I would still want it for my own psychological well-being. And there's this person at the laser hair removal center I go to, and they've recently decided that they want to transition. And it's one of these like relatively small towns, so people know each other, and their
mm,
co-workers were concerned, and so they asked me for advice, and they asked me to like, get in touch with this person so that I could offer them help or something if they needed it. And so they gave me their number, and I was like, yeah, if you need any advice, feel free to ask. And then I thought about what I would give as advice to somebody being about to transition. And the thing, as one trans woman put it recently on a date with me, she said like the whole approach of hiding away for a year or two and then coming out with your surgeries and hormones all done is the like rich or middle class approach to transitioning, which is foreclosed to so, and it makes life vastly easier. And I'm doing that. Like I'm literally like doing a PhD where I don't have to like, I'm not in a customer service facing job or anything for a good 3 years, and I can let hormones do their work, and I can learn voice shit. And so many people don't have that privilege, you know. And we need to do more than just like saying, oh, they don't have that privilege, because you're right, the political considerations are so different for these people. And saying these
yeah.
people sounds like really bad. I don't mean it that way.
I think it's like it's kind of a toss up because that is hard. Like so I couldn't like sit and uh like I couldn't kind of like let things develop and then kind of go out into the world. And that would have been nice, for sure, to kind of have that thing. I think that there ends up being a lot of resentment within the trans population between different trans people. I think too that kind of class difference, you know, you already have that kind of difference there, and then the more you kind of get what you want or get what you need.
Mm,
So, you know, the surgeries you need, or if you need just hormones or whatever it is, um, that you you come more to peace and you think less about the gender stuff. Meanwhile, the people who've not been able to get to that are still focused on that. So you there's an even bigger divide because you can't relate to it. You relate to it even less,
mm,
um, because you don't think about it anymore. You've had whatever done that you need to have done. They're all still thinking about that and focused on it. And so the last thing, I mean, kind of the whole thing is like once you've taken care of everything, why do you want to think about that stuff at all, really? So yeah, I feel like for sure there's like that kind of divide, and then I think there's a resentment a lot of times too towards, um, you know, trans people who've gotten surgery, and pass, and I think, you know, people can look at those classes and think that, oh, they've got it so great, they've got it so easy or whatever, and kind of resent them for it, uh, which just is alienating, you know. And it's alienating to the people who are complaining, the people who've not been able to have surgeries and things like that. Um, because, you know, they feel even more like they're not the right kind of trans person or something, or they're not the ideal kind of trans person. There's definitely class conflict. I think like that is what did I wrote it yesterday. I'm trying to remember if I wrote it on. Oh, I think I wrote it on the GC debates QT Discord, like something like, you know, you have gender critical people, and they all have that one thing in common. They do all have gender critical beliefs in common. Trans people don't have anything in common. Like, now I'd say that you'd be like, okay, well wait, they're all trans. We could say, okay, the one thing they have in common is that they call themselves trans, or they are called trans. But what does it mean? It means different things to different people, and it manifests differently. And so, of course, there's like conflict because, you know, you have someone who is, you know, classical transsexual, you know, girl who thinks that she's a boy and, you know, likes all the boys stereotypical stuff, and, you know, ends up transitioning and all that stuff, you know, is considered the same exact kind of person as, you know, a girl who wants to, you know, be seen as some sort of amorphous, ethereal, you know, fairy type creature. um like, that's also considered trans, and so those things are considered at large the same thing, so they're very much not. So there definitely is that kind of like class conflict, I feel like, just in the fact that, like, not even like, oh, one is better than the other, but it's like we're just that different. Like, there is
Yeah.
just such a spectrum of, I hate using that word because it gets overused, but there's such a spectrum of different kinds of like manifestations of trans. And so yeah, I feel like we fight each other a lot. And yeah, just like you're bringing up before, Bella, like, yeah, I get called a bootlicker. I don't know how many times I've been accused of being Blair White or being accused of being a rad femme. But then, you know, you go over to hang out with the gender critical people, and then they accuse you of being a trans rights activist and a gender ideologue. So it's kind of a
Yes.
lose-lose. No matter what you do, you're kind of the worst.
She what is it, Cat Black, who I love. Oh my, we don't, because like I said, we don't get the perspectives of people who've been living as trans for a long time. It's like, it's young fucks like me who are baby trans, who have been doing it for 2 years and are therefore still figuring it out and freaking out about it all, and we haven't been doing it long enough to calm the fuck down.
I feel like the internet's been like so good, but also like so bad at the same time, because I feel like it's given you like some good stuff to like think of that you never would have thought of before, but it's like giving you so much of that, like, that it's like overwhelming. That's well, and I mean, that's where I feel like you have a lot of people, like, you know, taking hormones who maybe don't even want to. I find that very interesting, talking to the D-trans people. That fascinates me in how they like never, so like, so, you know, participating in this male to male detransition Discord server. You know, they talk about, I'm very interested when I hear, you know, someone who has detransitioned that said that they had never had gender issues before. They always saw themselves as a guy or always saw themselves as a boy, and then they transition, and it's like, how did that happen? Like, how did you come to that conclusion?
Where does that
Like,
come from?
right. And it's like the only way I can see that happening is like, I see that when I see like Susan's Place, which I really wanted to go on a time yesterday, but I'm not going to.
You could go on about that. I have my issues with it. Yeah.
The but they, yeah, well, so you have like, I mean, and people say it's overblown, but it's I'm sorry, it's fucking adults grooming people, grooming kids, and grooming young people and vulnerable people. It's what it is. I feel like, even if I don't think that they necessarily are intending to do that or realize that they're even doing it, but they are kind of doing that. But that's where I feel really bad for anyone who's like stuck with all that, because I think it's easier. It was easier back when the internet um, was not so widely available, or it wasn't where I live. And so those, and there was like no LGBT anything. Like gay wasn't even really a thing where I grew up. So like for me, that I'm glad I didn't grow up now, in the sense of like I did not have anything to influence me in that regard. You know, I had other influences, but it wasn't anything like that as far as like a confusion. As far as like, you know, am I not, am I not? A different kind of confusion in my case, but
Same. I think
um,
like I was like just about, I was born in 1995, at the end of 1995. I was just about at that generation where we still grew up watching DVDs and such and or
mm,
cassettes, and we got the internet, but the internet didn't, first of all, the internet didn't have as much content as it did at the time, and internet culture was really different. And also
yeah,
kids' interaction with internet culture was really different. Like in my days, kids, for the most part, if they did politics online, it was like electoral politics and all this like the culture war stuff. But honestly, like trans issues weren't in the culture war at the time. It was gay marriage and evolution and yeah, stuff like that, and marijuana legalization. Those were the cultural issues on the internet, and the
mm,
feminists, like cringy social justice warriors. So I never learned, and I was really lucky, I think, that my introduction to gender issues and even trans issues came from my high school sociology teacher, who actually, I think in hindsight, was gender critical, just based on, because I
mm,
came into her class, this is a bit of a sort of personal story, but I came into her class like really conservative because I come from an extremely traditional family. And her class was the first time I learned actual critical thinking and like, oh, you need to have evidence and reasons to believe the things that you say rather than just God wills it. At least if you want to convince anyone. And
love
so
it.
her class was just like, and she used to like stay behind at lunch to like, because she changed my mind on so many issues and like just talking through social issues. I'm like, what do you think about this? Well, why do you think this way? Let's try and find some studies or some evidence to support it. And I fell in love with social science, and I went to do off to do it at university, and I've ended up living the life that I have because of her. But the point is, she introduced me to ideas like gender as a social construct and the difference between sex and gender from like, oh God, I was like 14, 15. And that really helped. The fact that I was getting it from textbooks and sources, I think really helped me get a sense of it as something that was real and something that was meaningful outside of the internet. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. We've got some
I,
amazing questions that I want to answer. So, AA again, like a legend, is asking, what are our hopes for the future of treatment for gender dysphoria? What,
I mean, my hope is to prevent it entirely. Um, I think that we can. I think one of the most important things is we need to take gender dysphoria and we need to like break it down into pieces, because gender dysphoria is so broad of a thing. I think that most treatments for most forms of gender dysphoria, as they are defined now, as they be classified now, um, could be just helped and even cured and totally alleviated with therapy, like just talk
mm,
therapy. I think that most forms of gender dysphoria, because I think that that's what is the best thing to come out of this, is we're all seeing just how much attributing non-sex related things to biological sex has harmed everybody, every single person. It hurts all of us. So I think that that is like we're seeing so many different kinds of manifestations of gender dysphoria, or we're recognizing gender dysphoria where we didn't realize that that's what that was in the past, or we wouldn't have thought of it that way in the past. So for instance, you know, a lot of girls are transitioning to living as boys or as non-binary as teenagers and as young women, because they're uncomfortable with their developing bodies, they're uncomfortable with their breasts, and it's especially because of how they're objectified and how they're harassed, how they're assaulted, and all of that. And so that's kind of an escape for them. That would be a gender dysphoria. It's not classical, it wouldn't be considered on par or the same thing as like, gender dysphoria of, a girl just grew up and she just for no reason is just uncomfortable with her body and, didn't have any kind of social thing she's trying to run away from. There's like those different ways that gender dysphoria manifests. So I think that like definitely most treatment could be just talk therapy. I don't think we can like pull away treatment as it is. I don't think it's fair to do that unless you have something comparable as an alternative to offer. I think that's pretty unethical to do. But then again, maybe it's not. I'm not a professional, so
Well, because that's the
maybe
thing
that's not for me to
is
say.
like I mean, you're right. You're right. I think it would be useful for us to talk about body dysphoria rather than gender dysphoria, because gender dysphoria, as in dissatisfaction with a social role, radical feminists are very right in saying that most people experience this to some degree, and they don't need to transition. So getting a clear boundary of when is difficult. And body dysphoria is maybe easier to define as like, discomfort at the secondary sex characteristics associated with one's birth sex. That's more easy to define, a more sort of clear and direct treatment method. And I think making the definition of transsexual stricter, to go further down the transmedicalist pipeline, to define it by body dysphoria, would eliminate those risks. It would eliminate people who are transitioning to escape sexism, as the radfems often say, and I think rightly say for many people, or to escape homophobia, or to escape anything else. I think it would certainly eliminate a lot of these things. And you're right. I think the problem is like a lot of people who say a lot of the times when radical feminists say that we should take away trans healthcare, they're not. The response I often get is some vague like psychotherapy, and there's no specifics of what psychotherapy or what methods. And optically, it looks really bad for them because the only model they would have would be gay conversion therapy, and they're advocating for a kind of conversion therapy. Like a trans activist who is rhetorically skillful could argue a gendercritical feminist down to be like, you want to convert people out of the gender identity that they have, so you're advocating for conversion therapy, and that looks bad. I do think radfems have an optics problem in general. AA again is asking a really good question, and AA, I like have so much respect for you, not just for all of your questions, but for this one specifically. How can gender critical folks make it easier for gender critical trans people in gender critical circles? Can I, Joanne? Because so I have had to leave a gender critical server recently because it was messing with my mental health extremely. It was Casey's server because the mod there is an absolute asshole and just kept sharing memes that basically painted trans people and specifically trans women as these disgusting, vile monsters, like this one, right? This is a meme which genuinely messed with my head, because it sort of sticks to a fear that I have, that an irrational fear, but it's still a fear. That everyone thinks I'm incredibly disgusting. So we have like a scale from likable to creepy, and we have industrial robots and cartoon characters on a lower end of it, and then trans-identified males, or like basically trans women, all the way at the creepy side of it, and then a human at the top, basically saying we look subhuman. So don't share memes like this in an
Oh
ideal in an
yeah.
ideal world. Also, don't share. And you can tell I've documented it because it's in my server and I've been talking about it. If I jump to it, don't share memes like this as well. These like caricatures of trans women as this. Like, don't share memes like that. It's not helpful. I would also move away from the rhetoric of like mutilated for various reasons. I mean, let's take natal females top surgery, right? Some detransitioned men are going to need to get that, and it's not nice to describe their bodies as mutilated. It's not productive. It's not necessary to describe those bodies as mutilated. Like, it's, you can describe them as modified, surgically altered, etc. But mutilated is an unnecessarily loaded term. Also, some butch lesbians who are going to still identify as women want top surgery for aesthetic reasons, and it doesn't do them any favors if you're coming at it from a feminist perspective to describe their chests as mutilated because they prefer their chest to look that way. You can question whether that comes from a healthy place, but I think it's not good to describe it as mutilated. So more amazing questions. Some people who aren't completely gender critical treat post-op trans people and trans people who can't afford the surgery differently. Do you think that's the right approach? And AA, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like part of what you're getting at is, Blair White did a video to the effect saying that with regards to prisons, that trans women should be put in male prisons unless they're post-op and have had genital reassignment surgery. Is that sort of the kind of angle you're getting at? Or a similar kind of angle? Of like, yeah, some people treating post-op trans people differently. Have you experienced that, of people treating post-op trans people differently in gender critical spaces, or who aren't completely gender critical?
Oh, me?
Yeah, have you experienced that?
Oh, there. Okay, so there's definitely. I would say the opinion varies. So I've seen. I think the majority consensus that I've seen has been post-op. So I guess if we're talking about trans women, because a lot of times that's really who radical feminists have particular beef with. I think the main consensus is having surgery means something, as far as if anyone is going to be allowed in like sex segregated spaces, so if anyone's gonna be allowed, if any trans person's gonna be allowed in a sex segregated women's space, it would be a post-op trans woman. But there are gender critical people who don't believe that. No matter, they're like, doesn't matter what surgery, it's still not that sex, so it doesn't matter. I think that I think part of what's tricky is I do think that you just, a lot of people act differently. A person can act differently post-op than how they would pre-op. And I think that people who have been able to, have things that they need to have done or felt they need to have done, people who've had the surgeries they've needed to have or whatever, they don't have as many problems then. They don't have as many issues. And I'm not saying that as like, oh, they have no problem, but they eliminated a major source of their this pervasive dysfunction across their whole life. So post-op people, I think a lot of times it's easier to get on in those spaces, and it's easier to get on with those people. So for instance, so I don't have a real vagina, I don't have a real vulva, but I have, what's the word, simulacrum, is that the word?
Simulacrum.
There's the word. Thank you. So yeah, I have a simulacrum of that. It's not the same thing, however, there is some similarities of function, so I can understand some of those things that might be unique to biological women, natal women, that other people don't experience, or that pre-op trans women might not experience. So it makes it easier to relate, I think, just with over time. And if you don't, I think, if I'm thinking about it, I would not have been able, I think, to do a lot of the things that I've been able to do post-op, pre-op.
Really?
There's just a lot that I would have not been able to do, because that's how much that affected me.
In terms of confidence, or?
Yeah, I think, well, and confidence, and not ever thinking about that. So like not ever having to worry about that. Because otherwise, so before that, took up a big piece of mental real estate, which
and
now it just doesn't.
I can, because I feel it. This is why one of the reasons I get mad at people saying I don't need FFS is like worrying about this takes up a lot of mental energy from me, which is why I talk about it as much on my channel. And when I don't have that, I could be a little bit more productive than I currently am, and that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. So many great questions.
Yeah, I'm like going through and looking too.
Yeah. This is a really interesting one. Some gender critical people are of the belief that gender dysphoria, unlike autism, has no genetic or a biological basis. So it's all because of how people have been treated by the world. Or what do we think?
I think that that's true for some people, and I think that that's not true for some people, and I think that it's true and not true for some people.
Yeah.
Again, kind of going back to that whole like, there are so many different kinds of trans people. I think that personally, there are trans people who there's something biological going on, but I think maybe we all have different biological things that are causing this, that lead to this, you know?
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and I think so speaking personally, I think that for me, there is something genetic to it, and biological to it. So like my dad and his father are both very feminine looking, very feminine acting, very feminine men. Just it's biological, and I look very much. I don't know my biological grandfather, but from pictures and my father, like I very much developed very similarly to them. Um, and it's clear, like, you know, I have exceptionally low, always had exceptionally low testosterone, exceptionally high estrogen, and problems with hormones. So there's something clearly biological different going on. I don't think that that alone would cause anything, and I don't think that, you know, all trans people have something like that going on, and you have plenty of people who have something like that going on who don't end up being trans, but you have that mix of something biological with social stuff too. um, I think it would depend on the kind of trans person that a person comes out as. So like if, you know, going back to the instance of like teen girls who are kind of trying to escape sexual harassment and objectification by, you know, living as non-binary or living as boys, that's uh not it's not biological, as far as like there's some sort of a hormonal something that could be affecting, you know, development or something like that, but rather that would be like mostly social. Whereas, you know, if you have something, uh you know, versus that where you're more feeling like, I don't know, your parts are wrong, or you know, parts of your body are wrong or something like that, that would be uh that could be biological. And also too, if you're looking at, I guess I'm thinking of that paper I think that I shared with you, Bella, that really old paper. Actually, I shared it in the chat, I think, last time you had it, where they're like talking about, you know, oh, in classical transsexualism, that like, you know, the people appear like more like the sex that they identify as, or that their target sex or whatever, where it's like, oh, there's some kind of a biological thing because the boys look so feminine and the girls look so masculine. So I kind
I
of went on a
mean,
rant there, but
no, it's fine. I'm personally always rather skeptical of it because I feel like oftentimes this ends up as retconning almost. If there's like hard science on it,
mm,
that's more of an acceptable, or that's more like credible in my view. I don't know. I just think memory is so fishy and in sort of how we feel and how we looked in the
yes,
past. Um, so yeah,
definitely.
really interesting question, guys. Thank you so much. Have we got any others that we've missed? I don't want us to have missed anything, because these have been amazing questions, honestly. Um,
Someone asked about Vietnam.
oh
Someone
yeah,
said
somebody
something.
asked about the
I don't
video
know
with
what
the.
that.
Oh yeah, there was a famous video of a Vietnam vet, and trans woman. It's on YouTube. We could probably do a live
Oh,
react
is
if
this the
people
Star
want.
Wars one?
It might be. Let me see. Should
Like
we
the
do?
brand new one where it's like the guy's like totally. like defending his sign at his store.
Vietnam vet trans. Oh, here we are. We know it's blown up. It's viral. Of
I
course
can't
it
remember what
is.
they call. I think they're calling him like Grandpa and over it, or like, yeah, Gramps.
Wait, what? Transgender person versus Vietnam veteran store owner. Oh no, here we go. This is going to be one of those trans public freakout things. Okay, let's have a look.
Popcorn. Got
Yes,
mine.
popcorn. Let's get some
With
self-hating
YouTube Premium,
popcorn
you can
up in
download
here.
your videos and watch them without Wi-Fi. Take your videos everywhere.
It's flavored with loathing.
You're gonna put that up and you're gonna let everybody else see it. Well, everybody loves it. Confronted by a trans woman, you're gonna hide it. Everybody loves it. No, I don't think pictures of it.
I think I watched this once.
Oh my god, the sign
when
read
it first came out.
just out
So
with the
I'm
Dr.
curious.
Seuss book. If you're born with a dick, you're not a chick. He had that sign up in his store.
Love it. Yeah, you know what?
Oh, that's pretty great.
No, what you're spouting is
It's funny. I mean,
Trans women are women, sir. That sign is bullshit. As a trans woman, trans women are women.
what
Oh,
I'm
no.
telling you as a man, that's bullshit.
Huh? Okay.
You know what? Nobody confronts your ass. That's the problem.
Really?
If they say,
Really?
what the
You want to bet?
what the is
You know
going
what I
on?
have
Do you know how many people you've embarrassed
Oh,
at City
wow.
Hall?
Me, an
They have to-
embarrassment to City
they
Hall,
have to
really.
tolerate
You're an
that
embarrassment
shit.
to the city,
like
sir.
I think
You're
that's
an
what's
embarrassment
funny
to
is
the
like
city.
I
it doesn't
am a
even.
pillar
Make
in the
sure that
city.
everybody knows.
I'm a pillar in this. Now
Oh,
you
yeah.
do
I
that.
think
You know
like he's
why?
not being
Every time
anti-trans,
some bullshit
really
like this happens,
genuinely being
my sales go up
anti-trans. Like he
because
just
people
doesn't.
are
I don't know. I think
wanting
he is. I
this.
think he thinks
Sorry,
it,
you are
like saying it's embarrassing to be trans.
You are
Right.
not. You're not a woman. You don't look like a woman.
It's-
You don't act like a woman.
That is so
Really.
difficult, and
You're
I have trouble
Ahead.
with
What's
this,
wrong with
and
you?
I
Well,
can
look at yourself. For Christ's
I can
sake.
see where
For Christ's sakes, who would want it?
GC's coming from, because I thought that was like kind of hypocritical, where it's like, okay, why are you guys like being so like, this is all homophobic, like this is all conversion therapy, like you're trying, like why are, like let the gay people be, but then like going and like doing that to trans people, where it's like not seeing it as conversion therapy, not seeing it as like, oh, this is, you know, being born this way. They don't see it that way. And so I found that kind of weird. I think, though, it's tricky because I don't know. I don't know. What is transphobia? What is anti-trans, or what is someone who's being anti-trans? Like, is it someone who doesn't know any better and they happen to make a faux pas or say the wrong thing,
I
or is
wouldn't
it
say
someone
that,
who
but-
genuinely hates them?
Well, because this guy
or-
seems to like be genuinely shaming her for being trans. But like what he's just said then about like you don't look like a woman, you don't act like a woman. I think that's the divide between sort of, like you said earlier, between passing trans people and don't. Because I feel like someone like you or I walking that store, he might at least be more willing to listen to us, looking and sounding the way that we do. Whereas he gets us just sort of, I think, ironically, I think it's gender performativism that does, like, this person's like biological characteristics get read so readily as like male, and most trans people compensate for those things by performing femininity to a larger degree, which is partly why I wanted to talk what I wanted to talk about. It's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about like trans liberation on the stream, because like I think we as trans people to some degree are actually constrained from challenging gender roles in ways that we wouldn't be by presenting as like the gender we are. So like me going into a men's toilet, like dressing the way I do and talking the way I do, is more radical than me going to, it challenges gender stereotypes more than me going into the women's toilet, because people don't say that women shouldn't dress like this.
right.
But more importantly, there are real constraints on what I can realistically do. Like I've been talking to a lot of natal female radical feminists about growing up and the shame that women get put on their bodies with regards to body hair. Like I shave mine, as many of them do, but so what's the word? I sort of have more of a requirement to shave mine because I have a requirement to shave it if I'm claiming to be a woman socially, because if I don't shave it, that's another element of my performance which is masculine and therefore works against my claim to be a woman, to be entering into the social role of womanhood. So I can't exhibit certain masculine traits in a way. And trans people feel this all the time as like the pressure of passing or the pressure of being self. Which again is one of those things, like we said earlier, that's dependent on surgeries and wealth to a large extent. And if you've had some of those stuff, you may be able to not think about it, not worry about it so much, and just let your life go on. But for those of us who are like in between, we are sort of stuck having to perform a more stereotypical gender in order for that to be believed, because a more stereotypical gender is safe. Somebody who's going in with like a vaguely or just a generic feminine look is not going to, people are more likely to glance at that person and think that's a woman. Whereas if I go in with like hairy arms or something, that's something which a cis woman wouldn't have her social role challenged on that, whereas a trans woman might, because a trans woman has more masculine features already, if that makes sense. So, but I think we already expressed this as the dissatisfaction with passing. So reframing that dissatisfaction with passing and that frustration of having to constantly perform a gender role could be reframed as, well, if you simply like acknowledge your sex as a social role, and use like use the spaces of your birth sex, it would still be difficult because you'd be fighting against sexism within your own spaces, but those elements of your biology would no longer work against your social persona, if that makes any sense.
Wait, wait.
I think
Elaborate on that last point.
okay.
That's interesting.
So like, well, like, elements of our biology are going to discredit the social performance we're having as women. Let's take this person, like her height and her stomach and everything like that. These are features which, in the eyes of many people in society, make her look masculine, and therefore that's why he says you don't look like a woman, etc. They contradict the claim to womanhood, and trans people feel this all the time as the pressure to perform a rather stereotyped version of our gender in order to pass. And a radical feminist and a gender critical claim of you can still dress like this, you can still do all of the things you do, but just like acknowledge your gender, so acknowledge your sex socially, and use sort of same-sex spaces, you'll still face some of that discrimination within same-sex spaces, because she'll probably get shat on in if she were to use the men's room, and I do get weird stares when I use the men's room. It's not comfortable, but first of all, those stares might happen in the women's room anyway, in my case, and it's a fight that's worth waging, I think, for sort of liberation from the standards of passing, not just passing for trans people, but passing for cis people as well, if that is making sense.
Yeah, that's like the whole need for acceptance of gender nonconformity and gender nonconforming expression. Because I know I talked to there's someone who posts in the debate sub who is she isn't trans, but she's extremely gender nonconforming and always has been, and has explained scenarios of like running into problems with using the women's restroom, even though she in no way identifies as a man at all, but just because she's so extremely gender nonconforming, with expectations of what a woman should look like or whatever, and although that's probably compounded by increased awareness of trans people and probably people reading into things, which actually that really does constrict us, because if you see any of that, like any sign of gender nonconformity, you're just going to lump them in with being trans. And I guess that's kind of the whole social phenomenon too, where it's like, oh, you paint your nails, yet you have a penis, like that's a sign that you're trans right there. It really does keep us lumped together, and that kind of brings me back to, I think, what you talked about in that other video, that concept of desisting without detransitioning, and kind of the difference between the two, where, because I think, with the gender critical people I've been interacting with regularly for the past 6 months or so, the consensus is like, that they're like, it is good to be you. Like, there is nothing with liking the things you like. If you don't hurt other people, if you're not like contributing to a bad system, that like you do you. That's awesome. And in fact, a lot of those. I'm sorry.
No, go on.
I say like a lot of those GC rat femmes like are all for it. They're all for like gender identity, and they think that's great. But we do end up like feeling like you it can't be too non-conforming, I feel like, and continue to function. Like, so I've explained before that, okay, if I'm going to detransition, what it would look like for me, the healthiest aspect, I guess I would stop taking hormones, or maybe I guess I would maybe take testosterone, but for me that's not healthy. I don't know, but that's a whole other thing. But I would look the same, I would dress the same, I would act the same, everything would be the same. But if I try to go into single sex male spaces, like just being as I am, it doesn't matter if I say no, it's okay, fellas, I'm a guy. That's still gonna cause problems. I get though, rat femmes, when it gets to that point, and I think too, when males, when we're talking about the issues we have, as trans women, it's like, well, okay, I can not assert my my feminine gender identity on it, as far as like saying like I can go around and if someone asks me and it's not like a big thing, like I'll tell them I'm a male, I'm a man, or whatever, like that's okay. But so that there's that kind of acknowledgement, but like I don't know, it gets to a point where like that becomes, I feel, dangerous with the way society is. Because they say, well, feminism is for women, the problems that they have, they're really concerned about women's stuff. Our issues as males do not concern them. Some of them I'm sure it does. Some of them I think it does, but like as the whole, it does not, and it shouldn't. But that is something that, like you say, like, and it annoys me, of like the kind of just get over it, or people kind of trying to transplain your problems and solutions to you, like how easy it would be to just fix these things. Like, well, gee, what you need to do is you need to talk to fellow men and you need to get them to change their minds. It's like, well,
yeah,
how easy is that then? Because we do sure know how well the majority of men like to listen to effeminate men, and kind of let them totally hang out with the boys and participate in that kind of space safely. So
no, totally. Like
it's kind of tone deaf, like it can come across as.
there was one, like the last time I got like probably laughed at in a men's public restroom. It was shortly after I'd been started considering detransition, and I always thought if somebody like questions me in the men's room, I'll like explain myself and be like, I'm a guy, I'm allowed to dress like this, whatever. And then they were just too like busy loudly laughing for me to get to word in anyway. So they did this. They were doing that with their head. They were drunk. It was so weird. I was just like, and I'm pretty glad I didn't talk, because if I had talked, that probably wouldn't have helped my case.
I'm amazed you still use the men's. Like, I'm amazed you use the men's room.
Other trans people say that to me. I don't know. First of all, I do think it's partly like I have a moral duty not to, but then also maybe I'm just paranoid about looking male. Anyway, that's my own dysphoria talking, I suppose. Shima Kiyoshi is asking, do you want to fit into an existing role or fit into your own role? I want to destroy the roles, quite frankly. Let's get rid of those roles.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think.
I mean,
So go on.
what were you saying?
I was going to say in response to something you said earlier that yeah, a lot of radical feminists don't even oppose trans people taking hormone therapy and such like that, although some do. And
Some do, like, across the board. Yeah.
yeah, so some are just like very extreme in how much they're like, and to the extent where like anything associated with trans people, they're like, oh no, that's awful.
Strong convictions. They have strong convictions.
Yes, no, exactly. So I mean that was one of the things that when I realized, one of the moments that made me realize, oh yeah, these people actually do have my best interests at heart, was talking to some gender critical feminists, realizing that they actually don't mean man and women as gendered terms in the way that most people do, and then also it was a realization from talking to them that they didn't really need or want me to change anything in the way I live my life, because I already didn't use like women's spaces. So like literally all they wanted me to do was like not call myself a woman. And it sounds like a silly thing, but I think actually it does have a lot of implications on for the sheer reason that if I say I am a woman because I enter into the social role of womanhood, this I think validates the social womanhood as a social role, which in turn legitimates natal females being expected to conform to that social role. If I like, to use the arm hair example, if I shave my arms as part of performing femininity so that I get perceived as a woman, that reinforces the idea that women shouldn't have like hairy arms, and that increases the pressure on natal females to shave their arms, if that makes sense. So my like it sounds like it sounds like a small thing, but me saying I'm a man who does these things alleviates the pressure on males not to do some of these things, to lower their voice or something, which some men do. And it also at the same time reduces the pressure on women to perform to femininity. So actually it sounds like really silly. Like in my first stream, I'm detransitioning, I talked about it with my friend Appius, and he was like, well, what does it really mean? You're just going to call yourself a man? And I was like, yeah, but that matters. That really does have a lot of impact. And it sounds silly, like, oh, you're not that important. But just as like a role model for the other people around me in my society, like I know that when I've seen a teacher like, or a professor be something, like be child free, it's given me a sense like, oh, I could be that as well. And it's okay to be that. And I think that when I go into the men's room looking like the way I do, it might make some guys who it might just make it a bit more normal for those guys, for somebody who is in men's single sex spaces, to be very feminine, to have a feminine voice, to have breasts even, etc.
Absolutely. I think that is really important, and that is like super huge. I think it really important as trans people, if you're gender critical, or if you are just willing to, I guess be a good ally and sex, when it's important, and not impede on the rights and spaces and integrity of others, that like that's a huge thing to demonstrate, and really good to see. I know for me as a person, it's very helpful to me to see others who have shown that, hey, you can still be a helpful person, you can still be a good person, and you can still follow your beliefs and still live the way you live, without being problematic. Or you can acknowledge all this stuff. You can acknowledge your birth sex. You can have people call you by that and still live and pass as whatever sex that you live and present yourself as. So I think that's important. And yeah, that stuff is small, seemingly, but that is really hard stuff for most trans people or allies to do, or they won't, for whatever reason. So that is a huge thing to like demonstrate to them. And I think important for trans people to see. And I feel like personally, as like a kind of older, I mean, I'm not old, I'm not old, like I've lived this way for a little bit, and So I have a little bit of experience that I feel like, I feel like, when you're older, you just set an example for younger people
Yeah.
that kind of might be following in your footsteps. And so I do feel like, that's a good example to set for others. Like, I can call myself a man and acknowledge born that way and all that stuff. And, if someone asks me, in a quiet, in a polite way, I'll tell them.
Yeah.
But still go about my life just, if it's not relevant, everyone just assumes that I'm a woman, biological woman. So you can have your cake and eat it too.
Exactly. That's the thing with like the different, like reconciling trans and rad femme people is like some rad femme people, and probably maybe even the loudest rad femme people, will tell you that you can't have your cake and eat it too. But a majority, I think, are okay letting you have your cake and eat it too, as long as you're not harming anyone else. And the matter of like what, because when I had it was like one big conversation I had with radical feminists that like opened my eyes on it. And when I realized that they actually did mean man and woman as non-gendered terms, and then also realized that they didn't expect me to change anything. One of them asked me, well, so if you acknowledge that your sex has had all these impacts in your life, why do you feel uncomfortable being called a man? Like, why does it cause you pain? Let's unpack where that actually comes from. And it was such an interesting question. It really made me think. And the argument that they made that it was some kind of residual sexism that I had left over from my upbringing is quite convincing. That on some level, I still think that calling myself a man means that I am letting people expect me to act a certain way, and I'm conceding to those expectations and that view of how I live my life. And that's not necessarily true, and that I can work as a man against those expectations. Yeah. And if you, to any trans people who may be watching this, if you like maybe would be fine with radical feminists if only they called you like a man or woman as your preference, why not sort of go the other way around? Why don't you sort of make the sacrifice, or not sacrifice, but why don't you make the concession? I think the YouTuber Vosh, who's rather controversial on the left, but whatever, he said that when people talk about compromise, oftentimes they like the idea of compromise, but when they say compromise, they mean other people giving up things that they want, and they don't think about the things that they would be willing to give up. And I think if we're going to have if we're going to create a productive relationship with gender critical people, like I asked gender critical people earlier to give up the rhetoric about mutilation and trans people being disgusting to look at. I think really, as trans people, we ought to give up the claim to manhood and womanhood. Well, not many, but some trans creators are already doing that. Like ContraPoints basically says, fine, you can call me a man at this point, I don't care, in her latest video, Envy. It's not I don't think it's a hill that it's worth dying on. It's a word, and I understand why that word causes pain. It still feels a bit weird for me to refer to myself as a man and be called a man. But it's work we need to do, and we need to concede something,
Yeah. I think that is the best concession, or the first concession that like trans people should make, and in turn the best concession that gender critical people can make is to, if not use preferred pronouns, to at least acknowledge that there is distress, and to not exacerbate that. I think that is the best thing, because I'm not a whole like ask me pronouns kind of person. I find the pronouns thing is very strange to me, but so personally that doesn't matter to me personally. However, I know that matters to most people, I think, or most trans people. But like, to just at least be sensitive and respectful of that, and not just flippantly referring to people as their biological sex, when they really clearly have made it clear they don't like that or don't want that, or have some sort of problem. It's like, I mean, it's because I think we were talking about this, like it otherwise starts coming really real close to looking like you're making fun of the mentally ill, which you kind of are.
Yeah, I'm, but
I mean,
I remember like I asked that question of like frankly the asshole mod Evan on King Critical's Discord server. Like, yeah, dude, you think we're mentally ill, so why are you like mocking us to such a degree? And he was like, oh, it's like it's almost like it's psychological warfare in the fight against patriarchy. Being nice isn't our priority, kind of thing. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm very skeptical of anyone who's like, we don't need to be kind to people. We don't need to be compassionate even to our enemies. And maybe this is my Christian perspective coming in here, but yeah, I do think it's very valuable to be compassionate towards people who you are opposed to, and certainly not unnecessarily cruel.
yeah.
I wish use they if you don't feel comfortable using neutral pronoun, and don't go out of your way to dead name people, like or look up their dead name.
I mean, that's the thing is like if you genuinely want to have a conversation, if you genuinely want to make progress, you won't do these things. You won't antagonize other people. I mean, you'll do whatever it takes to make the thing happen. So when people just start ripping on it, I mean, to me, that's indicative like, well, you're not taking this seriously. You just want, vent, or you just want to take out, you just want to make fun of people, whatever.
Yeah,
Cool if that's your thing, but I mean, don't act like you genuinely care when you really don't give a shit, or you're not gonna try,
yeah. To be sure, to be sure. Unless we have any final questions, I think maybe this would be a good. I think we've come to a nice conclusion of like we've talked about like ways to bridge the gap between
Yeah.
gender critical and trans views. We talked about some of the ways in which it can help. It can help people both on the gender critical and on the trans side, like live better, happier, healthier lives. AA says we need to be compassionate, not even a Christian. Also, it's pointless to shame mental illness. It's self-contradictory and doesn't do any good to anyone. Yeah, I want to know more actually, like in later streams about reconceiving dysphoria as a mental illness, because I'll talk actually very briefly about that, because it's one thing that is linked into what I said earlier about biology not counting against your social claim if you own your sex as an identity. Like me going out there, like saying I'm a man now, my brow bone doesn't like contradict people thinking that I'm a man, because the reason I claim I'm a man is because of a biological reality that does not depend on how others perceive me. And if I accept that as my sense of self, almost, if I accept as a self identity, yeah, I'm a man, and that doesn't mean I have to be anything else. It therefore doesn't matter. My dysphoria essentially is like it's like an irrational thought process telling me all the time that I look hyper masculine and much more masculine than I am. I mean, you expressed surprise even, Fleurista, that I still use men's spaces, and a large part of it is this idea in my head that I look extremely masculine, and that's, I think, in large part caused because of dysphoria. But now that I'm no longer claiming to be a woman, the consequences of that dysphoria being right or wrong are actually much less. I'm able to feel the pain of seeing my reflection and seeing all of this stuff, or seeing these masculine features. I'm able to see that and process that pain as like, this is just something that affects me. It doesn't matter for how I'm claiming to present myself to society. Other people aren't going to see this and think these features that I'm personally worried about are proof that Bella is lying about who they are, because Bella is not claiming to be a woman, and these features, even though they sort of go against femininity and therefore go against like the social role of womanhood, they don't contradict Bella's claim to that, because Bella is not claiming to be entering into that, if that makes sense. And therefore,
Yeah.
I can recognize that pain as it's still very real, it's still very powerful, and I want to take steps medically to help reduce it. But I don't have to also, I have to worry in my head, oh, this feels bad on a personal level, it feels uncomfortable, I don't like it. I don't also have to worry that it's going to make other people see me in a way that's contradictory to how I'm presenting myself.
That's just like removing like what could have been more distress for you.
yeah, it's like taking off
Thank you.
half of the stress of dysphoria, really. The stress of, oh, my dysphoria is making me think I look like the most manly man in the world, and therefore people aren't going to think I'm a woman. They're going to think I'm like delusional, or they're going to hate me. It reduces a lot of that stress for me, and maybe this is partly like my own personal insecurities that I need to work through, and probably the answer is partially yes, but it still helps. And every as the slogan of Tesco is, every little helps. And so awesome. I think that's a good point on which to wrap up the stream. Oh, one more time, I'm going to link Fleurista's channel in the chat. Fleurista, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
doing this. This was absolutely amazing. Guys, go subscribe to
Thank
Fleurista.
you.
Look at these videos. Amazing. First of all, she sings and she's great at singing. Like what? I'm jealous.
Ah,
Um,
thank
she,
you.
she also
Too
does
kind.
she also does art, and sometimes in her videos, I assume these are your paintings in the background. And wow, they're amazing.
Thank you.
And she
I'll
has
have actually a gender critical trans art exhibition opening up early next year. So
very excited
that'll be
about
available.
this. Yeah, Fleurista makes amazing points in general. She's just like really thoughtful videos. I highly recommend checking them out and going and giving her a like, comment, subscribe, all of that good shit to her channel. Thank you guys all for your great comments and questions, and thanks to you, AA in particular. You've had amazing questions, and I hope you guys are all happy, healthy, stay well, and have a great weekend, everyone. Oh, sorry, not weekend. I'm stupid. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.